Hi, welcome to Board Gems. This is my weekly video series in which I go over a board game gem, one that might be a little bit old or at least people aren't talking about anymore. I like to remind people about this game and let people remember, like, hey, yeah, that was a really good game. You know what? We should continue to play that game and not be so caught up with all the new stuff coming out. There are lots of great new games that come out too, but as is the mantra of this video series, old games don't stop being good just because new games come out. So this week is a request, and it is the most requested game, or most suggested game, that I've received, and that is of a game called Santiago. Now, this was designed by Claudia Haley and Roman Pellick, and it was originally published by Amigo in the early to mid 2000s. You might see that people say this English edition is from Z-Man. Actually, Z-Man just distributed the game in North America. Who fronted the money? It was Amigo. Amigo actually, nowadays Amigo produces English copies of a number of their games. But back when this game came out, nah. they didn't do it. They relied on partners. But this one, so you can see, like, it actually has, like, Amigo and everything, like, on the box. It doesn't say Z-Man, except I think maybe on the back, in tiny little print, it says distributed by Z-Man. This is an Amigo game through and through, and it's in their kind of standard long box. At least there was their standard. I don't know if they still use that format anymore. The box says 3 to 5 players. It's a Goldilocks game. That's a term I use to describe a game that has a player range, but the game doesn't really scale between the different player ranges very well. So a 3-player game tends to be very wide open and loose and not very tense, but the 5-player game might be a little too tense, a little too cutthroat. So what that translates to for hobbyists is that you probably want at least 4 players for this game. I wouldn't bother playing it with 3. It says ages 10 and up, probably pretty fair. I don't think kids would like this game all that much. And the box says 60 minutes. In practice, I find that it takes a little bit longer. It is a little bit of a thinky game, so people can take their time to think about their turns. I would say typical games last more like 75 to 90 minutes. So I'm really excited to do this one this week because this is a game, you know what, I don't get a chance to play it very often, but when I do, I have a smile on my face the whole time I play. And this is almost, in some ways, the quintessential board gem because this game is so special. It hasn't been fired by newer games. It is deeply, deeply interactive. The rules just melt away, and it's just the players and what they're doing to each other, and oh, I love this game. Let me show you how it plays. Then I'll talk more about why it's a gem. To set up the game, place the board on the table between the players and choose a starting location for the spring. If it's your first game or if it's a game with 5 players, you'll probably want to just stick with the middle 6 intersections. They always go in an intersection of these long ditches, these thick lines. If you're playing with fewer players, or if everybody's experienced and just wants a more brutal game, you can even place it on the edge or even the corner. But for a first game, put it in one of the central areas. Take the canals, that's these blue sticks, put them to the side, give 1 to each player, and also give to each player all the yield markers, that's these cubes, of 1 color, as well as this, which is sort of a canal proposal. So each player gets those of their own color along with 1 canal and 10 escudos to start. So let's get some escudos. Let's get some money. 10. Like so. Choose a start player. The start player will get this canal overseer marker, although that will change during the first round. Mix up the 45 tiles. They show one of 5 different crop types, as well as 1 or 2 workers in the corner of it. So you're going to mix up all these tiles, the 45 tiles, and you're going to make 4 or 5 equal piles depending on the number of players. So in a 3 or 4 player game, you're going to make 4 piles of 11 tiles, and in a 5-player game, you're going to make 5 piles of 9 tiles. In a 3 or 4 player game, there's going to be one tile left over. Reveal it, everybody can see what it is, and just put it back in the box. Now, the goal of the game is to make money. You're going to start with 10 bucks, escudos, and you're going to get 3 every round, but you're also going to be able to give money to the other players, and at the end of the game, you're going to score for your crops. And technically, the crops will score you money, and that's why the game comes with these large bills. In practice, usually players don't bother using these large bills because these only come into play at the end. So you can just total up your total score at the end of the game and then add whatever money you have left over, and that's your final score, and the player with the most money or points wins. Players are going to be adding these tiles to the board, and when they add tiles to the board, they're going to be adding these markers, these yield markers, onto the space, which is how many points they're going to get for each tile of that type all connected together. So right now, if it looked like this, white scores 1 point per tile, so 2 total, but black is scoring 2 points per tile, 4 total. The catch, there always is a catch, is these tiles have to be irrigated. That's where the canals come in. The canals will always come out from the spring, and they'll always be added along these lines. You'll never add them like that, that's not allowed. And you never add them to the thin lines. These just kind of demarcate the tile spaces. So you might, over the course of the game, end up with something like this, at which point this tile is irrigated, and this one isn't. A tile has to be adjacent to a canal in order to be irrigated. And once a tile is irrigated, its yield markers are going to stay there for the rest of the game. The canals never get removed or dried up. But for every round that a tile is not irrigated, it gradually dries up. And you're going to remove yield markers from those tiles. And if it looked like this, at the end of the round, white would have to remove their yield marker. It's still going to score points for black, because it's still part of this crop, but white's now no longer going to score that point for it. And if it's still not irrigated, then we flip it over. The whole tile is dried up. If it looks something like this, right, something like that, for example, and this is irrigated, this is still considered part of the same crop. The canal does not separate them. So this is currently scoring 12 points for black, 4 markers times 3 tiles. But if this were to dry up, let's say there was no canal there, and instead the canals ended up kind of going around, it looks something like that, then this is no longer considered part of the same crop, it's dried up, and now this is only scoring black 4 points. 2 times 1, 2 times 1. So your goal in the game is to get your yield markers on these tiles and make sure they're irrigated. And players can work together because multiple players can share the same crop and get points for them. So the first thing that happens every round is you flip over 1 tile per player. So it's going to be 1 tile from every pile that you set up at the start of the game. And then there's going to be an auction. Starting with the player to the left of the player with this token, the player with the canal overseer always goes last. So starting with the player to their left, you're going to go once around the table. And each player has an opportunity to give a single bid. Just 1 bid. It won't come back around to them. They won't have an opportunity to increase the bid. Each player must either give a unique bid or pass. Any number of players can pass. But if one player bid 1, no other player can bid 1. They would have to bid 2 or pass. And so each player in turn order, with the last player being the player with the canal overseer marker, throws out a bid or passes. And in this way, there's going to be kind of a ranking, right, from first to last. The player who bid the most is going to be going first. The player who bid the highest is going to get first pick of these tiles. The player who bid lowest will get last pick of the tiles, but will be the canal overseer for the coming round. Now, multiple players can pass. If one player passes, then that's the lowest bid. It's like a bid of 0, so they will definitely be the canal overseer. But multiple players can pass. And if multiple players pass, then the player who passes first is considered last place. Now, a player who bids first would pay their bid and pick any one of the tiles and place it somewhere on the board. And then they would get to place a number of yield markers equal to the number of people on it, like so. Then the player who bid the second highest will pay their bid and they will get second choice. And maybe they might do something like this, for example. Let's say that was gray. And so on until all players have claimed a tile. Even if you pass, you still get a tile. However, by bidding 0, you put one fewer yield marker on it. So if this is the tile that a player gets, and they passed, they're not putting any marker on it. If they passed and they got this tile, then they're only putting one marker instead of 2. So let's put the rest of these on. We'll say purple passed. So let's say purple did something like that. Now purple passed, and let's say purple is the only player who passed, so they're going to be the canal overseer for the coming round. But because they passed, they only put one fewer marker on this tile. So because there would normally only be one marker, they actually put 0. Now the next thing that happens is the canal overseer gets to choose where to put a canal. However, the other players have an opportunity to bribe the overseer and to offer their own suggestions. So starting with the player to the left of the canal overseer, the player can take their proposal stick and place it somewhere on the board. It doesn't yet have a canal. So something like this, for example. Maybe something like this. And they must offer, if they do that, they must offer a bribe. They can offer any amount of money. They can also pass and not do anything, but if they make a proposal, they have to offer at least $1. And then other players can either pass or make their own proposal, going in a different direction, and offering their own bid. And of course, they can offer the same amount or a different amount, but they're offering their own bid. Instead of making a new proposal, a player can back up a previously made proposal. Gray, for example, might very much like Black's proposal. The Gray would like the water to go here this way, so he could add to the bid. He could say, okay, I'll add 2 to that bid. So after everyone has had a chance to make a proposal or add to a proposal or pass, then it's the canal overseer's turn. And the canal overseer can either accept one of the proposals offered or go their own way. If they accept a proposal, they don't have to take the highest valued one. They could take any proposal that was made. So in this case, purple, who is the canal overseer, could accept this bid of 1 to place the water here. Or could accept the bid of 3 to place the water here. Or the canal overseer can put it somewhere else. They could decide to instead put it somewhere completely different, like here, always connected to the spring, of course. But if they want to do that, they have to pay the bank $1 more than the highest bid. So in this case, if purple chose to do that, not accept any of the proposals, they would have to pay the bank $4. But if they accept one of the proposals, let's say that one, then they get the bribe. In this case, it was $3, and the water that goes to the canal overseer. White, in this case, their proposal was not accepted. They get to keep their $1. And that's the way it looks like right now. So right now, these tiles are irrigated. This one is not. Now, again, starting to the left of the canal overseer, each player may, if they want to, place their free canal. But only one player can do so each round. So don't wait too long before placing your free one. You might not get a chance if a lot of players are thinking the same way you do. And then the board begins to dry up. Any tile which is adjacent to a canal is considered watered. Any yield markers that are already on there will stay there for the rest of the game. This tile, even though it's, I guess, technically next to the spring, it's not next to a canal, and so this is going to dry up. And the process of drying up is the player will remove one of their cubes. If they only had one, they would remove that one. It would just be like this one, a tile with no markers on it. And if a tile with no markers dries up, then again, you would flip it over to show the desert side. And after that, each player gets $3. And then it's a new round consisting of flipping over the 4 or 5 additional tiles. And again, starting with the left of the canal overseer, each player makes a single bid. And you're going to keep doing that. There's 11 rounds in a 3 or 4 player game, and there's 9 rounds in a 5 player game. At the end of the last round, A, no players get that $3 income, but B, any tiles which are not irrigated at the end of that last round immediately dry up. Even if it still had markers on it, if this tile was not irrigated at the end of the game and it still had a marker on it, this marker would come off and it would dry up. You just dry everything that is not irrigated. And then you total up your points. If it looks something like this, of course the board will be mostly filled. But right now, gray and black are both scoring 4 points for these peppers, 2 times 2. But of course you can have very large crops. There's 9 tiles of each type, so you can have very large crops with many yield markers on them. And at the end of the game, you're going to score for each individual farm, I suppose, even these ones that are just 1 tile. And each player is going to score number of yield markers times number of tiles, and add that to whatever money they have left over. And the player with the most wins. That's it. You're ready to play Santiago. Oh, this is my kind of game. All right. I love this game. And when I don't play it very often, might play it once every few years. But because I don't know, it's a little bit hard to get to the table, I guess. Mostly because it's not a new game, right? But when it gets to the table, like if I like making suggestions and I suggest Santiago and everybody seems like, oh, I haven't heard of it, but yeah, I'll give it a try. I'll be like, oh, yes. Right? I just have a smile on my face the whole time I play. So what can I say about this game? It is deeply, deeply interactive, okay? And that's what I want in a game. I really do. When you're taking a game, a lot of newer games, right? There's so much complexity, and it's not like I'm dumb. Like, I don't mind complexity. I just don't want complexity for complexity's sake. All right? Like, a game like Democker is crazy complex, but everything feels like it kind of ties together. So in the end, it doesn't really bother me all that much. But there are some games that have extra mechanisms or seem complex, and it's not all tied together. And the result is, it's like, I think the designer was just making it complex because that's what they think people want. And maybe some people do. People, there are lots of hobbyists out there who love complexity for complexity's sake. They want that mental puzzle. But I want that mental puzzle to not come from the game rules, in which how you score, how you win is obfuscated by a huge amount of interconnected mechanisms that are really hard to kind of push through to see a way to win. I want not complexity, maybe that's the wrong word, but I want the thought process. I want the strategy, the tactics, the thinking to be not about, oh, how can I manipulate this game to give me 5 points instead of 3? It's, you're playing against the other players, and it's their motivations that you have to consider, right? So this game has, I love this term. Somebody else coined it. I loved it. The co-opetition. It has a lot of that because you have a crop, right? You have a crop type, and you have a bunch of tiles, and I may own some tiles, and you may own some tiles. But if we're able to grow that crop, add more tiles to it, we both benefit. So that's a consideration when you're playing the game is, you're obviously, it's not a team game, it's not a cooperative game. In the end, you're trying to get more money or more points than the other players. But during the game, you'll have a little bit of, that this player wants to do well here and this player wants to do well there, and maybe I can help that person, maybe I can stop that person. And it's just, that's a constantly changing calculus you have to do, is just try to, you want to benefit yourself, but you don't want to benefit yourself to the exclusion of other people, and that's impossible anyway. You have to kind of choose your battles, and you have to choose, sometimes you work with somebody else to try to buff up a cropland in order to, for you both to benefit, right? But maybe you'll benefit more than the other player somewhere else, so in the end you win, right? Deeply interactive. I can't stress that enough. I mean, there's a few ways that it's interactive, right? Obviously, you have the auction. It's a once around auction, and that can be, a once around auction can be extremely punishing. I'll give you an example. So I think the last time I played, it was with 4 players, and there was an auction at the beginning for the tiles, beginning of the round, and I was the last player to bid. It's once around. It's not going to keep going around the table. Just each player gets one bid and that's it. Well, the tiles that were drawn, one of them is amazing and is immediately beneficial because there's a bigger crop, like there's more of that crop, and there's an empty space right next to it that's already irrigated. You're not really going to see that in a 5-player game all that much, but in a 4-player game with a spring in the middle, you might see some spaces that are irrigated with no crops there. It's possible. That takes away a little bit of the tension when you're playing with 4 players. But anyway, so everybody wants that tile, but I'm going last, which means I can guarantee I get it. I just outbid everyone else. So the first 2 players, they bid small amounts or they pass or whatever. And then it's the player to my right, and they have to decide what they're going to bid. Do they bid low or do they bid high? If they bid low, then I'm going to get that tile for cheap. So what do? They bid high. It's like, okay, I paid 1 escudo more than that player, and I got the awesome tile. So yeah, he made me pay for it. But look at his result now. He's paying almost as much as me for a much, much worse tile, right? If he bid high enough that I didn't want to outbid him and I bid low, then it was worth it for him, but he'd have to judge how much money I had and how much I'm willing to pay, which also he has to think about me, right? What type of player am I? Am I the type of player who likes to go all out, or am I more cautious, more timid? See, again, that's what makes one of the ways it makes this game so interactive is you're playing the players, not the game, and players' personalities can come into it. Like, I know that person and their style of play, so I'm going to make a calculated guess that they're going to do this, right? Oh, yee. Makes me happy. But yeah, that auction can be brutally unforgiving. But in terms of the interactivity, you're also looking at one player being the canal overseer, right? And that player is potentially going to get paid by the other player, so there's an interaction there. And the consideration that people have to give, if am I going to bribe the canal overseer, and if so, how much? Because if I bribe a tiny amount, if everybody bribes a tiny amount or doesn't bribe at all, well, the canal overseer, they're just going to pay 1 escudo extra, and they're going to put the canal wherever they want. Maybe if they don't even have any tiles on the board or hardly any, then they could just put the canal going out somewhere completely different and just screw everybody else over, right? So you have to bid high enough that it kind of discourages the overseer from doing that, and they want to accept the bid because they want that extra money. Money is pretty tight in the game. But how much do you offer, right? So one thing that people tend to complain about a little bit is the board. It's a little drab, a little dry. But you have to realize that this board, by the end of the game, is going to fill up with really colorful tiles. The board is quite small, and normally for a game that plays a lot of people, like 5 or more, I'm really kind of against small boards because in the end, maybe 1 or 2 players are off to the side. They don't feel close to the action. They can feel kind of disconnected from the experience. I haven't found much of a problem with this game because even though the board is small, because the tiles are brightly colored, single color. The cubes are fairly large and kind of stand out in their single color. So it's pretty easy to see from a distance the state of the board. And there isn't really a lot of hidden information. So I think it's actually perfectly fine for the maximum of 5 players, and some would argue it's best with 5. Now, as I said, it is a Goldilocks game. And a Goldilocks game it's a term I use. I don't know if I invented it. I'll claim I did. But it's also possible that I just read it somewhere and it entered my mind into the back and then popped up when I started doing this video series. It's a game that has a range, usually 3 to 5, but it could be 2 to 4, but 3 to 5 players, say. And the experience doesn't really scale very well in those different player counts. So a 3-player game is really wide open and it's not very tense. You can kind of do whatever you want. And a 5-player game is a knife fight in a phone booth, right? You're just trying to get some elbow room. So this game doesn't really scale very well. Now it does scale because, so you have, like in a 3 or 4-player game, you have 4 tiles each round. And in the 3-player game, the player who bid the highest also gets to place the last one, but they don't get to place any cubes on it. But anyway, that makes it 11 rounds. Whereas in a 5-player game, it's 5 piles and there's 9 rounds. I don't mind it 4 players. There are a lot of people in BGG who swear by it with 5. And that is definitely the most brutal way to play. I'm fine with 4. The thing is that because this is an auction game, and it's not just auctions in terms of auctioning for the tiles, but there's also the offering of bribes and deciding who you know, somebody else has a offer like a bribe and you want to add to it. That becomes more interesting with more players, right? But it does become more brutal. So for example, when to be the canal overseer can be really important, because the canal overseer obviously will get to choose where the canal goes, but they also have the potential to get some money, some extra money, and money's pretty tight. Well, that's easier to kind of maneuver in a 4-player game. And in a 5-player game, it may be hard to be the canal overseer. If there's a player to your right, for example, who tends to like to be the canal overseer, and they're usually bidding ahead of you, and if they pass or bid lower than, really low regularly, you may have a hard time becoming. It's more fun if people can kind of take turns, right? And the other thing is, of course, you have each player has their own canal. And once around, one of the players is able to put down their free canal. Well, only one player per round can do that. So what happens is late in the game, like especially in a 5-player game, you have 9 rounds, then it becomes really, really tense. Like, will I even get a chance to play my free canal? Because if I wait too long and other players wait too long too, they may, on the later rounds, play their free canal and then I won't be allowed to, right? I've played 5-player games in which I still had my canal at the end, and believe me, I didn't win those games. So, look, 5-player game is super brutal. The auctions and the bribing and stuff, that part's more interesting, but it's also harder to kind of time things. And the timing, like for the canal overseer, is really important. When to be the canal overseer can be a really important part of the game, because you get to choose where the canal goes, but also you have potential to make a lot of money. And if you time it wrong, there may not be a lot of pressure. And this can happen, actually. This is kind of an odd thing. So in a 4-player game, it's easier to be the canal overseer, but it's also easier for it to not be that worthwhile to be the canal overseer, because there's enough water on the board, enough tiles are getting irrigated, that maybe by the time you're the canal overseer, okay, I'm ready for my bribes, and nobody's not really interested in bribing you all that much, because they don't really need to. There is enough water on the board for now. The crops that could be watered just aren't that important right now. So in a 5-player game, there's less water, of course, per player, and so that becomes much, much more important. But it's also harder to kind of time that. So the spring starts on the intersections of these deep ditches, the thick lines, right? And for the first game, they suggest placing one of the 6 kind of central, away from the edge intersections. But you can place on the edge, that's allowed. You can even place in the corner. So one suggestion would be, if you're playing with 4 players, place it on an edge. If you're playing with 3 players, place it on the corner. So that totally works. I would still recommend, if you're playing 4 players, first game, still put it in the middle. And 3 players, I would probably avoid it. But if you are going to do it, yeah, consider putting it in the corner. Just to create a little bit more tension and a little bit harder to get the water going the way you want, because there's just fewer branches. I don't know. I would probably just not bother playing it with 3. It's a 4 or 5 player game, basically. Whether this is a big deal or not is really kind of dependent on you. But one kind of issue a little bit that I have with the game is that all the tiles will be visible at some point in the game. So there's 45 tiles. In a 5-player game, you're using all 45. So there's 9 rounds and 5 piles of 9 tiles each. And in a 3 and 4-player game, you have 4 piles of 11 tiles each. There would be 1 tile left over, but everybody gets to see what it is before you put it in the box. So all that information is out there, right? And you know there's 5 crop types and there's 9 tiles of each crop. It can be important for your mental calculations to know whether there are any more bananas going to come out. So it's like, oh, if I know there's a banana coming out in that last round, that's important for me to know, and I want to save my money for that. Well, that's one problem with the game, because you can't even see from the board state initially how many of the tiles we've seen. So there's 9 banana tiles. Let's say there's 7 visible face up on the board. So there's 2 unaccounted for. Well, there could be some remaining in those stacks, but when tiles dry out, you flip them over and they're face down, and they're obviously all the same face down, right? They have the same illustration on the back. So you can easily forget, like, oh, was there a banana that dried up? Like, and it can be important to know that, right? So that's a little bit of a downside to me, because the game is so tight and there's so much, again, I don't know if strategy is the right word, but there's so much thinking that you can potentially do about your turn and about all the things that you can do on your turn, that coming up with that, like, valuation, especially for an auction game, right, and the bribes, how much to offer, becomes very, very important to know, like, what's coming. Now, what I usually do is I mean, I'm not a really serious gamer. I usually like to play by the seat of my pants kind of thing. But I like to puzzle it out when I'm able to. So one thing I like to do is, in the second last round, the penultimate round, you're flipping over, 4 or 5 tiles, and there's still 4 or 5 tiles that are face down. I would suggest just flipping those face up, so everybody can see, okay, in that last round, here are the tiles that are going to be auctioned. Not really necessary earlier, but it's just something I like to do, because that last round can be really important. Like, you want to know, like, yeah, are there bananas left? And then you can see in that second last round, okay, there is 1 banana and it's coming next round. You could possibly do that for all the rounds, actually. I haven't tried it, but you could even, like, reveal the tiles for this round and then reveal the ones for the next round. Minor thing, I love the game as it is. Just occurred to me that might be a neat thing to try. There's a lot to recommend to me for this game. It is a bit long, okay, so you're looking at 75, 90 minutes for a game, but everybody's involved. There's lots of table talk. Like I said, the rules are really simple. They just kind of melt away. There isn't really negotiation per se. The rules do say that you can make non-binding agreements, like, hey, tell you what, you put the canal where I'm suggesting this turn, and the next time I'm canal overseer, I'll do what you do. You could do things like that. Also not necessary. But yeah, there's a lot of table talk. It's not really a negotiation game, but it does support that if that's your play style. It's an experience game. It's a memorable game. When I introduce this, generally everybody I introduce it to, maybe not some non-gamers, but for people who are into the hobby, who've played it, they've all pretty much liked it. And some of them I've actually noticed that we'll actually talk about the game like next time, right? Let's say next session they'll be like, "Hey, did you remember that game of Santiago? I was thinking about that game, right? It's like, oh, I should have done this differently." Like that's what you want. You want a memorable experience. There's so many games, and some might argue a lot of the games that I cover in this video series might be like that for some people. That might be forgettable. Like last week's game, Hansa. I can imagine some people might be like, you play the game and then it's over, and then you kind of forget you even played it. I love Hansa, but I can understand if people think of the game that way. But Santiago's not like that. That's a memorable game. Now, whether it's memorable because it's frustrating or it's memorable because of the just how interesting the game was will be dependent on your experience. And it is possible, especially with a 5-player game, to have a bad experience. So my suggestion about the player range is you're going to have everybody on Board Game Geek telling you 5 players is best. Yes, for a bunch of experienced players, that is the most brutal, the most cutthroat. For a first game, 4 players is fine. And actually 4-player games also have a little bit better of an arc. Maybe that's the wrong word, but for one thing, there's more rounds. There's 11 rounds instead of 9. So players have more of a chance to do things. And it's less forgiving. And I realize that to a hobbyist, that's not a good thing. You want it as unforgiving as possible. But especially for a first game or just for casual play, 4 players is completely fine. And one could argue that it's experienced as balanced for 4 players, like a typical Goldilocks game. So if you want a really easygoing game, you play with fewer. If you want more tension and more cutthroatedness, then, if that is even a word, then you want a 5-player game. And the 4-player is the balance. Doesn't mean it's best with 4, and that's subjective. And hobbyists are going to tell you it's best with 5, but that experience is balanced for 4. The balance between tension and lack of tension, I suppose. Because it's a longer game, and because there's so much information that's out in the open, and it can be so unforgiving. The once around auction, you got one bid. What's it going to be? It's very important. It could be susceptible to analysis paralysis. Maybe I just play with really awesome people that hasn't been a problem. If people want to take a moment to think about it, let them. If people haven't made their move in 5 seconds, don't be like, come on, keep it going. No, dude, we're having fun, right? And for some people, the thinking is the fun. Yeah, if you're taking 2 minutes to think about your turn, no, don't do that. But if people want to think for their turn for 20, 30 seconds, let them. So it really, for me, it kind of encourages a little bit playing by the maybe not the seat of your pants. You can puzzle it out a bit, but not like, because it's a multiplication, like it's number of cubes times the size of that field, that's your score. It's also easy to kind of just get a feel for it, right? Oh, that's a big field. They have a lot of cubes in it, so they're going to score a lot. And it could just be that. You don't have to say they're going to score, 16 points more than I am. No, they're going to score a lot more. And so I need to think about that. It's not going to be for everyone. It's a little bit of a longer game. It's thinky. It's unforgiving. But it sets out to do what it does perfectly. And every game of it is an experience and is a memorable experience. It doesn't mean you'll have a good experience, especially if you're playing 5 players. Everything could go wrong for you. You may have a bad experience, it's true, but it'll be memorable. You will have that experience. And if you can get into it, it's it's a great game. I love it. It is definitely a worthwhile board gem. Thanks for watching. Remember, older games like Santiago don't stop being good just because new games come out. Take care.